Just give me 1 second. That I have a second name. So my other name is Kwe Ekudang Beka Maniduwawo. And my other name is in the language of Anishinaabe-Moan. Some of you might know that as Ojibwe. One of my aunties named me when I was about, I think I was 16 or 17. And so my name is actually in a different language than what my family is, which is actually kind of cool. So it's kind of fun getting to learn two Indigenous languages, specifically just because my name is in one. So how can Indigenous food systems help tackle climate change? First, I wanted to show you 3 pictures. These are 3 pictures of 3 very important women in my life. Oneste, or you might know that as corn. Oseheta, you might know that as beans. And Ona Osera, you might know that as squash. So on the screen are 3 Haudenosaunee varieties of corns, beans, and squash. And I wanted to start off with this picture because I think our corns, beans, and squash are very beautiful. And we don't take the time very often to look at the personalities that they have and to appreciate them for who they are. Corns, beans, and squash are extremely important to a lot of Indigenous peoples across North America and South America as well. In the Haudenosaunee creation story, our creation story starts off with a woman, and we call her Sky Woman. Through the story, she ends up falling through a hole in the sky, and she ends up coming to what we now call Earth. In the story, she eventually passes away, and she brings with her to Earth seeds. And in her hand, she has seeds of all kinds of different plants you can think of. They're things like corn, beans, and squash, but also things like strawberries and like every single tree you can imagine. Our creation story tells us about where life came from, and it teaches us about evolution. Some of you guys might be learning about evolution right now in school. Our creation story also teaches us about our responsibility to creation, right? So it teaches us as humans that it is our responsibility to care for the rest of the world, to care for all of the plants, all of the animals, and to have a relationship with those seeds that Sky Woman brought with her to the earth. Our creation story teaches us about the importance of community. In the story, there's lots of different animals and they all help out Sky Woman in different ways. And through all of their teachings, they teach us how important it is to have a community and how important it is to take care of your community and to be an active member of your community. This story also teaches us about kindness. All of those different animals are very kind to Sky Woman, and they take care of her in multiple different ways. But it also teaches us about the kindness that we need to have as humans towards those seeds that we take care of. It teaches us about the importance of death, which I find a lot of other creation stories don't actually touch upon. In this creation story, one of the animals, muskrat, ends up dying. And it's a very sad moment in the story. But this moment in the story teaches us that in order for life to be created, death needs to happen. And we learn about that when we learn about gardening as well. And finally, the creation story tells us about food systems. Specifically, it teaches us about our responsibility as Haudenosaunee people towards our own food system. It includes corn, beans, and squash. So some people call corn, beans, and squash the 3 sisters. And this has to do with the fact that these 3 ladies have been grown together for a very long time. They've been grown in North and South America for over 10,000 years, And a lot of archaeologists do a lot of research, and they end up finding a lot of areas where they can find these seeds that are still buried within the ground, which is pretty cool. On the map, you can see where Haudenosaunee communities from our own oral history, where our communities believe that we came from. So we have stories about the migration that we took. And what's actually kind of cool is that if you look into where the genetics of corns, beans, and squash, and also sunflowers, where they have traveled from, you can actually trace the migration back, which is really cool. So that's just one concept of the history of where the Three Sisters came from. The Three Sisters are pretty well known in the gardening world, you could say, in the agricultural world. But some people don't know about them. So corns, beans, and squash are grown together because they each have a gift that they offer to each other, which is really cool. So they teach us about reciprocal gift-giving relationships. The squash, if you think about squash, if you've ever touched a squash plant, it's very, very prickly, and the leaves are very big, right? So the leaves, they spread over the ground and they shade out all of the weeds. But they also, because they create that shade, they make it so that when it rains, the water is retained in the ground for a longer period of time. The beans, they actually climb up, depending on what type of bean you use, but some beans like to climb. And so they will actually climb up the corn, and the corn gives them that place to grow and to climb. The beans actually have these special little microbes. Um, when you plant beans, they attract these microbes. They're called nitrogen fixating bacteria, and they like to stick on the roots of the beans. And these little bacteria actually put nitrogen into the soil. So they go through all kinds of different chemical processes, and they end up creating nitrogen, which is able to be taken up by the plants, specifically by the squash and by the corn. Corn uses a lot of nitrogen, and so that's one thing that it really needs help with, right? And so the beans act as a really good friend to that corn. And then finally, there's the corn. So it kind of acts as um, this tall, standing woman who takes care of everybody. You can kind of think of her. So the history of corns, beans, and squash is quite complex, and I didn't want to get into it too much, but I did want to introduce it to you so that you could have a bit of a discussion of it with your teachers after you see this video. Um, Throughout the history of Canada, and also before Canada got created, there have been attempts at something called genocide and assimilation that were used by the British, the French, but also Canadian officials. So what does this mean? This means that for a very long time, but also today, British, French, and Canadian officials had very, very strategic plans where they actually wanted to get rid of Indigenous peoples completely. Um, and so they did this using many different ways. They used things like the Indian Act, which is a form of assimilation through policy or through law, right? They've also used tactics like war, but also things like burning corn crops. So I wanted to introduce that to you. So I'm going to read this quote. In 1697, in the Dennisville invasion, it caused little loss of manpower to the Iroquois, or the Haudenosaunee, but the destruction of some 1,200,000 bushels of corn was absolutely crippling. Um, and this is from a diary of an early settler, um, one of those settlers that came to this area and took note of what they saw happening. So to put this into perspective, one bushel of corn is about 56 pounds. Okay, so I don't know how much you guys weigh. Maybe some of you weigh around 56 pounds, right? And 1,200,000 bushels of corn is 67,200,000 pounds. So that's a lot. That's a lot of corn. And so if you think about the amount of corn that Haudenosaunee Iroquois communities were growing when settlers first came here, you can kind of imagine how large of a society we had. It was quite overwhelming for a lot of settlers because they didn't expect such um, such busy, such boisterous, so much things going on. Our communities were doing very well. So I want to introduce you to beans. There's actually 32 different species of beans. Um, Beans grow in 3 different ways. So there's pole beans. They like to grow up things. So they've got vines and they like to grab onto things. There's climbing beans, which get to be really, really tall. Climbing beans are sometimes they can grow to be like 15, 16 feet high, and you have to make things for them to grab onto. And then there's bush beans. Bush beans like to stay on the ground and they like kind of grow like a little bush. An interesting fact is that in the World Food Bank, there's actually 40,000 different varieties of beans. So um, on the screen here, I've got 5 different types of Haudenosaunee types of beans. But if you can imagine, in that food bank, there's 40,000 different types of beans. And so, like I said earlier, beans are responsible for nitrogen fixation. That's what those little bacteria on their roots are doing. Um, and so when these assimilation tactics, genocidal tactics were used on Indigenous communities, a lot of our varieties, specifically the ones at the bottom, were almost made extinct. Um, and so there's only a handful of people now that actually still grow these types of beans. There's also squash, so ono osera. Squash is really good for water retention, like I mentioned. And there's actually 5 different species of squash. So on the screen, I've got a whole bunch of different types of squash. You might actually recognize some. Um, my favorite type of squash is actually this blue one or this green one, the big, big one on the screen. It's called a Hubbard squash, and they're really, really delicious. And finally, there's corn. So there's actually only one species of corn, which is really cool. But there's 6 different families of corn. Some people will call them the 6 major types. There's sweet corn, like you might be used to. That's that corn that you can get at the grocery store. The one that you'll have like on a hot summer day with your family at a barbecue. But there's also 5 other types of corn that a lot of people forget about. There's dent corn. So dent corn, you can see a picture on the screen there. This corn is usually used for animal feed. It's what people like to feed pigs and cows and chickens and stuff like that. There's flint corn, which I actually have some with me. Flint corn is a very hard corn. So these are 2 types of flint. Oh, sorry, that one's a flower corn. This is a flint corn. So this is called Six Nations blue flint corn. And flint corn is very, very hard. And it's actually very good for climates where it can be kind of humid and moist and your food doesn't keep very well. So flint corn is actually very, very good for the region that Southern Ontario is in. There's also popcorn, right? So this is one everyone forgets about. Popcorn is a totally different type of corn than sweet corn like you would get at the grocery store. And then there's flour corn, which I have 2 types of flour corn here with me. I have Six Nations white flour corn, and then I also have some Mohawk red flour corn. Flour corn is used for making, obviously, flour. So we use flour corn for, you grind it and then you can make cornbread and you can make tortillas, you can make tamales, stuff like that. And then finally, there's a corn that's called pod corn or grandfather corn. This corn is really, really cool and it's very, very old. So if you can imagine, on a grandfather corn, every single kernel of corn is actually, it has its own husk. So you know when you have to peel corn and you usually peel it like this, every single kernel would have its own little husk. And I've been taught that corn is sometimes used as a deterrent to make sure that animals will stay out of the garden. So, corn. Why am I talking about corn? So, I wanted to remind you that Indigenous peoples' ancestors, so my ancestors and maybe our ancestors, in my opinion, are the ultimate scientists. Um, our ancestors were really, really smart. So our ancestors conducted unimaginable numbers of controlled experiments to develop the thousands and thousands of different varieties of corns, beans, and squash that exist today. I've only got 3 in my hand right now. So on the screen, I wanted to show you kind of how corn genetics work. You might learn about genetics in class a little bit. This is actually something you could do with your class. So you could ask your teacher if you can grow some corn and learn about how corn genetics work. So I want you to imagine that you have 2 different types of corn, okay? Kind of like these 2 here. Now in corn, a dark color is classified as a dominant gene, okay? And a yellow color is classified as recessive. So people that have blue eyes, your blue eyes, they're recessive. I have blue eyes as well. So if these 2 corn were to have babies, their corn will look like this one, right? Because the dark color is dominant. So kind of like brown hair. Brown hair is dominant, whereas blonde hair is recessive. So if those 2 were to have a baby, their baby would be dark, but it would have the ability to have other babies that were yellow, right? So you can see on the screen that when you cross 2 corns that are, one is dark and one is yellow, their grandchildren, you could say, could end up being yellow and black. And so why I wanted to show this to you is because it shows you how long it would take for all different colors of corn to exist, right? So Indigenous peoples have been in North and South America for, some people think, over 100,000 years now. And so we've had that much time to be able to make different types of corn, which is kind of fun. So Indigenous peoples are geneticists, right? So we know how to modify corn to make it so that it is different types, different colors, but also so that it works in different regions, which is really important for climate change. Indigenous peoples are biologists because we understand plants, we understand how they work. Indigenous peoples are chemists. The way to eat this type of corn, flint corn, flour corn, we actually have to do something called nixtamalization. And nixtamalization makes it so that the corn is not so hard and that your body can digest it. Sometimes when you eat corn, especially sweet corn, you might notice that when you go poop, your body doesn't fully digest it. It just comes out exactly like it went in your mouth, right? And that's because we need to put it through nixtamalization in order for your body to fully be able to absorb all of it. Indigenous peoples are ecologists, so we understand the land, we understand the animals, and we understand how everything works together. And finally, Indigenous peoples are also astronomists, and I wanted to show you this calendar that I made recently. A lot of Indigenous nations in North America use turtle shells, specifically snapping turtles, to tell time. So this is our calendar, and the way that you read it, you start up at the top, and you kind of follow those arrows. So in our communities, every time there's a full moon, that tells us that we're going through a cycle, right? So you can see on this calendar that we start off with a new moon, right? And there's 28 days between every single new moon. And from the new moon, at about 14 days, we have a full moon. And every time we have a full moon, it has a special name. And you'll notice that in Gunyakehaga communities, so the language that you see on the screen is Gunyakeha, or you might know that as Mohawk. And you'll see that we have a planting moon, we have a strawberry moon, we have green beans moon, green corn moon, the harvest moon, the food storing moon. And each of these moons tells us about our responsibility at that time of the year. And so it's very important for us as Haudenosaunee people to continue to grow out our seeds so that we can uphold that responsibility that we have to the land. Finally, I wanted to show you this because I think this is a really great way to show you why having so many different varieties of corns, beans, and squash is important for climate change. Indigenous peoples, we have developed all the different varieties of corn that exist. There's thousands of them. You can look online, go and Google it. You can just find all kinds of ones. And these types of corn are already adapted to different regional climates in North and South America. Flint corn is great for places where it's very wet, right? Kind of like here, it rains. It's kind of, it's very cold and it's moist and it's wet and it, like that. There's corn that's really good for places where there's droughts, right? So Hopi pink corn that you see on the screen can grow in the desert. And there's also corn that is really good for places where it's very windy, like the plains. There's corn that can grow in the cold, right? So like painted mountain corn can survive cold winds and drought. There's corn that can survive super high heat, and there's corn that can survive a combination of a whole bunch of these. So in order to be able to um, tackle climate change and to be able to eat in a sustainable way, we need to start realizing the growth of indigenous varieties of corn, beans, and squash because it allows us to have more sustainable crops. These crops are suited for the environments that we live in. And because there's so many different varieties, as climate change changes our regions, right? So say the area that we live in, say all of a sudden we start experiencing lots and lots of droughts, then we know that maybe this corn is not as great for this area anymore. And we can ask our neighbors if we can grow some of their corn. So how can indigenous food systems help tackle they help us with climate adaptation? We have so many different regional varieties, right? They already exist. And all we need to do is pick up the teachings behind. We also have food storage practices. So like our squash, we smoke them and we dry them out. We dehydrate them, and it makes it so that when we keep them for a long period of time, we don't have to use as much energy. And you might have learned in your other classes how we're trying to reduce the amount of energy that we use in our daily lives. Indigenous food systems can help tackle climate change because we have sustainable growing practices using something called permaculture. And we also follow that lunar calendar that I showed you. That lunar calendar goes with the cycles of the earth. Indigenous food systems are community oriented, so it means that we have to be connected to each other and we have to talk to each other. And we as humans have to share our gifts, share our talents, and we have to talk in order to solve the issues like climate change that we're facing. And finally, our economies are reciprocal and gift giving. So, for example, the act of sharing seeds is very reciprocal and it's a gift to be given indigenous varieties of seeds. I've always been taught that we don't sell seeds and we shouldn't buy seeds unless we absolutely have to. But once we are responsible for a variety of seed, it's now our responsibility to give those seeds as gifts to people who are ready to pick up those responsibilities and those teachings. So something I wanted to add here is how can you support Indigenous communities? So here's 3 things that I want you guys to try to do. You can grow Indigenous or heirloom varieties of seeds in your garden. Maybe your class can start a garden this spring, and it'll be ready for you by the fall. So if you guys wanted to start growing a variety of corn, a really great corn to grow in school is popcorn, because you can plant it in the spring, and by the time it's ready and it's nice and hard, kind of like this one, it'll be ready in end of September. So when you come back for the next year of school, you can harvest that popcorn and you can have popcorn as a class. Learn an Indigenous language, even if it's just learning how to say hi and my name is. Our languages, just like our varieties of seed, are classified as endangered. And so the more people that start to speak Indigenous languages, the more we're more likely to have our languages survive. And then finally, learn the true history of Canada, even if it means that you have to do it on your own. A lot of the times in school, we're not taught the parts of Canadian history that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But I think it's important for us to talk about those things, because unless we do, we won't be able to move forward as a society. So some words that you might want to discuss with your class is Indigenous, Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, assimilation, genocide, the Indian Act, species, heirloom, and any other words that I might have said in this presentation that you might be a little bit confused about, right? And that's okay. Learning is all about telling other people when we don't understand something, and don't be afraid to tell your friends or tell your teacher that you would like to understand something better. Okay? So with that, I say, Nyamakoa. That's how you say thank you very much.